a very quick overview, Cuban co-ops. Before the revolution, there were very few, supposedly some historians have written that there were a few self-proclaimed co-ops around transportation mostly, but they were not really co-ops. There was in 1940 in the Constitution, it was like a very short-lived, very progressive government that lasted like 100 days, and they passed a new constitution that proclaimed to promote co-op, but it was never rule there was never like still we don't have a law for cooperative, general law for cooperatives. And so in the 1953 attack to Moncada, which is seen as the beginning of the revolution, Fidel, when he had to defend himself, when they captured them and he has to defend himself, his defense is called the Moncada program, which was explaining what they were aiming to do with the revolution. And as part of that, he mentioned the importance of cooperatives as a way of basically improving the lives of workers, no? And also of the people. At the beginning of the revolution, there were some things called people stores, which were kind of like consumer co-ops, but more like community, so everyone in the community was kind of like a member, but the most important types of co-ops that have been developed in Cuba are agricultural co-ops, as I mentioned, which were created as part of the agrarian reform laws. There were two laws passed, one in 59, the other one 61, and so as part of that process of handing land to the people who work the land and getting rid of big latifundios, not sure how you say that in English, the government encouraged, unlike in other socialist countries where it was imposed, the government kind of like predicated, convinced about the importance and the benefits of joining together the farmers who were made owners of the land, to come together to be able to receive the support services that the state was going to provide them, and access to inputs, credits, and markets, no? And so initially it was in the forms of associations, but then especially in the 60s, it was cooperativas I'll talk about this, what they mean, each ones, but it was the cooperatives of credit and services in the 60s, and then there was like a new wave that was part of the process of so-called institutionalization of the revolution, because it wasn't until like 15 years later that Cuba decided, okay, we need to do something more institutionalized, and then is where we got a lot of influence from the Soviet or Russian model of socialism, no? And as part of that institutionalization, it was decided to promote another more socialist type of cooperative in ag, which are the cooperative for agricultural production, which are really worker co-ops in ag, which is not very very common in other countries, no? And then in the 90s, with the fall of the Soviet bloc, it was necessary to divide up these big state farms that were not able to continue to produce at that large scale because of lack of all the inputs that were received from the Soviet Union and other countries in the Soviet bloc. And so workers that from one day to the next is like the saying, they change from laborers, no, like state workers, to members of these co-ops. There were many lessons learned. We can discuss a bit more like what that all meant later, but those are the three main types of co-ops that emerge and increase in those different waves. And then we had in 2012, as part of it has been called the process of actualización, kind of like updating of the Cuban model. It was finally decided that yes, we need to promote co-ops beyond agriculture, that yes, they need to be autonomous, and of course they need to be socially oriented. And so that's how in December 2012, legislation was passed that would allow, with experimental character, to create these worker co-ops. It was mostly, it's open also to producer producer co-ops in outside of agriculture. So like small producers coming together, no? Like there's a difference between workers and producers co-ops, and that people who produce separately and come together just to sell, or so they don't contribute their labor, they contribute the results of their work, no? But it has been mostly worker co-ops, and in a few, it's like around 1 year, there were around 500 co-ops of this new type that were allowed, and around 430 something were created. And also there were measures around the same time to strengthen initially the UVPCs, which were the ones that had the most problems. I'm sure you know why, because of what I mentioned, how they were created. And then all these measures to strengthen the UVPCs were expanded to the other types of co-ops in ag. And finally, in 2018, there was a law decree that brought together all these different types of co-ops in ag and had one legislation for all of them. Before, there was one for each type. And finally, last year, in August, there is a legislation for worker co-ops beyond agriculture, which is not experimental anymore. So now everyone who wants to create a worker co-op or one of these co-ops is able to do it. During the experimental time, the approval process was all the way up to the Council of Ministers, and they only allowed like for a year, because there were many more requests to create co-ops that they were ready to do, and I can explain also why. And finally, the brief overview is that we are still waiting for a general law of co-ops that has been announced since 2015 by Raúl Castro, and the president then, and it was mentioned soon after, like late last year or early this year, it was mentioned again that that's still in the legislative schedule. No, it's going to be discussed sometime. We don't know, because it has been 2015. It's gonna be almost a decade later. So not sure. I don't want to say when, but we still can continue to wait. And so, what are the numbers for different types of co-ops? The ones that are the most numerous are the ones that started earlier. So like the credit and service cooperative. These are I'll explain later more about them. And then the UVPCs, which there were many more. This like as you'll see the peak, there was like twice this amount, because it was like big farms that were divided into much smaller areas, and the workers who worked there were the members of the co-ops. And as you see, there are many members there too. And then we have the CPAs, agriculture production cooperatives, and then the newest ones, no? And you can see in total it's around more than 5,000, with around like 500,000 members, no? That doesn't count the people they hire as worker, which is, as we'll see, is very limited to have for co-ops in Cuba to have wage workers. And then I can just say that after Venezuela, based on the numbers I saw from the ICA, International Cooperative Alliance, and people who have other statistics, Cuba is second after Venezuela in terms of worker and producer cooperatives. So like in other countries, there can be more cooperative, but it's mostly like consumer credit union and savings and credit co-ops. So it's like a significant number of, despite being a small country, despite having all these limits to the creation of cooperative, it's still many cooperatives for Cuba, in Cuba. And they create like around 11% of the employment, and they just with the membership, and they manage more. It's like close to 70% of the land, no? So that's how they have evolved since the 70s. That's where I was able to get the data. You see, it was around that time that the CPAs in, I think that's like red, were really push, no, and this the CCS are the one in purple, and these were people who benefited from the agrarian law reform, so people who became landowners and decided to join these CCS, which are like the most common type of co-ops around the world. They keep their land, and they just come together for inputs and to sell and some services, and the access to credit. And then the CPR, what happened there is that people were convinced to sell their land to the co-op, so they are joint owners of the land. And what is different from other types of co-ops, both and also the UVPCs, is that the people, you don't have to be a landowner or have had own land in order to be a member. So people who contribute their labor can still be members of any of these co-ops. And then the UVPCs, as I mentioned, they started like around 3,000 at their peak and have been decreasing in number the fastest because of all the problems I mentioned. They were created at a time where Cuba was in a really deep crisis, having lost like 85% of their economic partners or trade partners. And so it was a time where you had the government had to take very quick measures, and there was no time to prepare or to train people about co-ops. And so they were also the way they were created. They have many design problems. For example, the co-ops had to buy first the fact that, like, of course, the voluntary principle, like people didn't really know what they were getting. Nobody was forced to join, but they didn't have many other alternatives. And they had to buy the equipment, so they started with huge debts. They were very limited in what they could produce, who could sell them, etc. And so that's why one of the main reasons why UVPCs have been declining, because many people left to other co-ops or to join to work to other jobs. Many failed too because of these debts, and so they were closed, and so yeah, that's why you see the numbers go down. In terms of CPAs, the main problems are around, you can see the red dots, there is some decline too. The main issue with all these ag co-ops too is the fact, as in many countries, there has been a migration from the rural areas to the urban areas, no? And so there is less and less people who want to live and work the land, no? With the death of the founders, right now it's only like 2% of members were the actual founders, the people who created the co-ops. And that creates all kinds of problems too, especially since, as I have argued, in Cuba, despite having promoted all these co-ops, we don't really have co-op promotion policies, no? Like integral promotion policies, or the institutionality that is needed. So this is to say, just to show that as part of the updating, so the latest reform process that we have been experiencing since 2008 really that it started, but the main measures, it was around 2011, 2012. So then it was decided that the state could not manage all these economic activities, and so the non-strategic or fundamental economics activities were going to be transferred to the non-state sector. And so this was the plan that the Ministry of Economic and Planning presented in 2011. They wanted to increase employment in the non-state sector. I'm going to explain what that is, like more than twice, no? And also they were hoping all this contribution, like around 44-45% of GDP coming from the non-state sector. And so it's in this context that the non-agricultural cooperative are promoted, and I'm going to explain more about that. So I'm going to say here, the non-state sector, this is the Cuban way of talking about the private sector in the US, because we don't understand cooperatives as being private in the sense that it's not for the benefit of a group that excludes other. No, the whole idea of private property is that this is mine, it's not yours, or it's not theirs. And so in Cuba, co-ops are not seen as private entities, they're seen as non-state in the sense that they are independent from the state, finally, that has been acknowledged, but that they are not just for the benefit of the members, no? That they have to have, as like if in the Principle 7 that I'm sure you know, the Universal Co-op Principle 7 is all about cooperative committed to the benefit of the development of their communities, no? And so this is the geographical distribution. As you see, that it's not very good colors, but the lightest blue here, and if you see Havana, I don't know if you can see my cursor, those are the new CNA, Cooperativas Agropecuarias, the non-agricultural co-ops. They are mostly by large in Havana, but they are also around Havana, like in Artemisa, Mayabeque. Those are the western provinces, and Matanzas. So they're mostly in the western. And then the other types of co-ops, you can see they're kind of all spread differently around the country, no? In terms of economic activities, their main economic activities, of course, there are many are in agriculture, because of what I showed you, but also we'll see more details about what type of economic activities the non-agricultural are doing, but it's mostly around food, like restaurants and cafeterias. There's some. The other big is there are these markets, so like produce markets, but also construction and some services and light manufacturing, transport also. So this is where I go a bit more in depth, and I want to leave. I was told we have until 10:30, so I'm gonna try to leave like half an hour for Q&A, questions and answers. But as I mentioned, if anyone has questions, go ahead. And I'm going to share this video later, since I think you can watch it later to make sure we have time for Q&A, but it's good to see the actual people in these co-ops, no? And I don't know if you're gonna have the chance to go outside of Havana. There is much more of Cuba that is in Havana, but I know it's hard sometimes to go far from Havana. So these are the three types of co-ops I mentioned, and I just wanted to highlight here, like the credit and service co-ops are the common producer farmer cooperatives around the world. What is different is that the administrative staff and like the manager are members of co-ops, unlike in the US and many other countries, no? So everyone who contributes to the co-op can be a member. The agricultural production cooperatives, those are like worker cooperatives in ag, and they can hire wage workers permanently, but with very limitations. And the basic units of cooperative production, those are the UVPCs. These are the ones that were created out of state farms. And you can see from the name, initially they were really hybrid, no, between state enterprises and worker cooperatives. And yeah, they enjoy like free usage of land, no? But they had all these problems that they inherited from the fact that they were created with much preparation and inheriting all the like obsolete equipment from the state, and yeah, so they had to reinvent themselves, also change the way they produce, like they didn't have the same inputs anymore. The machinery soon was not worth much because they were not piezas de repuesto, replacement, spare parts. So they had to, as out of necessity, many of these co-ops had to adapt agroecology and like organic production methods, no? So here you can see the type of products, like agricultural products that you see the UVPC, no? They produce relatively more sugar, so that's a very hard crop. And of course, the only buyer of these crops were the state business, who were then sell it, no, like exports. So the UVPCs were very tied to state enterprises from which they would actually buy inputs and sell what they produce. So it was a very dependent relationship with the state. And the CPAs and CCS then also had, it has varied over time, but around 2012, they had to sell most of what they produced to the state. But then it has been diminished. So now at one point, it depends. Right now with this crisis, I think it was changed again to ensure that, because what these co-ops produce is mostly for what is called social consumption. So the idea is that the state provides the inputs are subsidized, and subsidized price so that the state institutions like schools, hospitals, what people receive in la libreta, like the rationing, like the food that everyone gets. Although most of that now is imported, but the idea is that what the co-ops produce is for people to feed the people, so you cannot put high prices. So there was many price controls, and then it was kind of reduced the number of crops. At one point it was around only 5 that had price controls, and then the number was increased because there is so little production and there is a lot of demand, little supply, inflation, etc. So it has changed over time, but the trend is towards these co-ops to really not depend on the state for like selling what they produce, and also more recently for how to buy their inputs, no? But for example, diesel, no, that they need for their riego, watering, etc.
Irrigation.
Irrigation. The only supplier is the state, no? So they still depend. So they have some dependency on state to buy their inputs. No. So this is just to show how land tenure has evolved and how the UBPCs have decreased in land. So because there was a process in 2007-8 where idle land was redistributed to individuals, but also CCS. So in blue, you see the CCS, how they have increased. And only recently also CPAs have been able to receive some land, but you can see that the amount of land that CPAs have managed is kind of around the same. It might be, I don't have data since 2014, so it might have increased a little bit, but yeah, so the tendency is land with a decrease of UBPCs, that land has been acquired by CCS. And so it has been shown that for the most common produce, like milk, all that you can see here, the output of co-ops in red is much higher than state farms. So it has been proven, no, that I'm not gonna get into all the factors, no, but they're much more productive than state farms, you can imagine. And in terms of profitability, or like ability to have surplus, no, like to have higher sales than expenses or costs, CCCs seem to be leading, and then CPAs, and then UBPCs. You can imagine all the problems in UBPCs. And people who have studied, some people argue CCS are more profitable because, you know, they own the land, they can make more decisions, etc. And other people say, no, people who CPAs that are really working as true co-ops, people also feel owners of the land, you know, like collective ownership is also ownership. The thing is that that CCS have access to the black market more for inputs, and so they're able to have more inputs than the CPAs. So like inputs that would have gone to UBPCs, maybe some CPAs that are not working well, or state farms end up in CCSs because the individual farmers buy what is in the black market and is able to have higher yields. And also they hire more wage labor, no? Because these are family farms, and they hire season labor, and for the CPAs, that's more limited. So what are the main difficulties of the ag co-ops? It's mostly problems with their autonomy because of what I mentioned, and access to inputs and also sales that has changed, improved, and as I explained. But I think also it's not possible to create second tier co-ops, and we know that many of the problems or the challenges that ag co-ops have are addressed by coming together like many other co-ops. And despite the fact that these second tier co-ops, I think in the US you understand when I talk about second tier, so like unions or federation, but it's mostly like union type, it's like for production purposes. These second tier co-ops were mentioned in the legislation for the non agricultural cooperatives, but understood as second tier co-ops that could be created by ag co-ops too, but they were never actually, like, the rules were never passed, so they haven't been really created. There are a few de facto second tier co-ops, and supposedly they are going to be, but until we have the general law of co-op, it seems we'll have to keep waiting, and which is a big shame because I think they could be the solution to many of the problems that the ag co-ops have. And of course, access to supply, equipment, all these. I'm gonna talk about the impact of the US embargo or blockade. Every enterprise of any kind in Cuba, whether state, co-op, or private, we all suffer the consequences of the embargo, no? Lack of labor force because of what I explained, people moving away from rural areas, what I mentioned about the marketing, like selling. Cooperative education, there has been some, but it's very limited. And when I have this appreciation, you know, like as people might not think this, but I think as when you get to Cuba, you will see that we are very critical, like, despite the fact that some people say that we are not, but we, like people who study co-ops and know what a true co-op should be, we think that in many of these ag co-ops, you know, many decisions are taken by consensus and all that, but it's more like a formality. But then I'm gonna share, and you're gonna be able to read soon, a study I did on co-op governance in Cuba, and what I have learned, like when I was doing this assessment, and I still think it can be better, no? But when you compare governance systems in our co-ops in Cuba, and especially in ag, to ag co-ops in the US or in any other country, the co-ops in Cuba in ag, whether CPAs, CCS, or UBPCs, are much more democratic than co-ops in the US, for example, or in other countries, because they have general assemblies not once a year, but every month. And despite the fact that the legislation now doesn't establish that it has to be every month, they continue to have every month. And they have all these spaces for deliberation and decision making in like work teams, that when they get to the General Assembly, there is already agreement on what they're going to be voting on, no? But of course, not every co-op works well, and we think it can improve, and yeah, but it's good to know that where I'm coming from, no? And how they compare to co-ops in other countries. This is just to show how the number of CCS has increased, but also has decreased. Now, this doesn't count for the new people who receive land. So if we count those, it's going to be like around, as I showed in the first slide, like 400 something thousand. And then the members of CPAs and UBPCs have decreased because of what I explained. So now we have only a few minutes for this non-ag, but I think it's fair to dedicate a lot of the time to the ag co-ops because they have been around longest. And so this is a video you can watch later. This is a worker co-op that produces like printing, but also basically it's like 3D paint printing. And so they do all kinds of stuff. Also toys for children, things for children, education, etc. So these non-ag co-ops started as I explained. They were approved. This like around 500 between March 2013 and like April or so 2014. So for in that lapse of like 1 year, and then they stopped approving more. So they supposedly they were around another like 500 proposals of people who wanted to create co-ops that they were never approved. They were not even looked because it was decided, no, we're not gonna, this is just an experiment. We're not going to create more co-ops. And they supposedly found all these problems and they wanted to correct before generalizing. And so you can see how it has changed. That right now there are around 473. Since the passing of the new legislation, around 58 new co-ops have been created. So like September to now, which if you compare to the number of private business that have been created, seems little. But if you compare, then I did the math of how many co-ops we had of this CNI versus the private business in the form of self-employed, but that were really like private people who hire labor. And the new and what I found is that there are actually the ratio is actually a bit higher, no? And so yeah, I'm just mentioning this because when you go to Cuba, I'm gonna say, oh, there are these, I think it's like now around 5,000 new small and medium enterprises, private enterprises. And many of them, like half are former self-employed who have converted into or officialized, no? That's not the word. Their status as a private business that hires labor, no? And yeah, I think I should. And this is just to say that during the experiment, one of the main goals, as I mentioned, was to transfer some activities from the state. So the state decided, for example, the state should not be managing cafeterias and restaurants or some other type of businesses. For what the way it happened, it was that the state that was in charge of those like workplaces decided, based on a public policy, no, they decided, okay, let's see if the workers here, let's kind of like pick. So one of the problems with that experiment was that the decision to create the co-op or the conversion was coming more from above than from the workers themselves. So in the first wave, there were some people I interviewed. I did a research, I'll show you later, of the first group of co-ops that were created, of these co-ops. And in some cases, especially older people, they kind of got into the co-op because they didn't want to look for another job. They were given the ability to relocate, etc., if they didn't want to be in the co-op. But then after, like the second wave of co-ops that were authorized, people were really excited because they were actually, as you'll see, the income, once workers were seeing that, yes, they could manage their workplaces, that yes, they could increase their income. More importantly, yes, they can make decisions finally of what they want to do and how they want to do it. the people who work in the state business that were to be converted that actually wanted that to happen. And the problem was that there were some workplaces that they were really eager to convert into co-ops, but the state enterprise management didn't prioritize them. So that's another conversation maybe we can discuss later. But this is to say that around 70, at the end, these were the approved, but in the ones that were created, like around 75 of these 430 something that were created before the current legislation were co-ops created of state businesses, no, like so conversions. And to be fair, I think many lessons were learned from the UBPCs. And so this time they didn't have to buy the equipment, only what they wanted to buy, and they were able to negotiate. So they had really good prices for the equipment they bought. They could rent what they didn't want to buy if they wanted to have access to that, and they had really good rates for the spaces, like the buildings that they were renting. They had access to credit. They were really like independent in how they wanted to, even the price they wanted to sell and who they wanted to sell to. There were only a few, like for example, transportation of people. They had to follow like the price control for transportation. So only like social impact, a few activities had some price controls, but also access to subsidized inputs. No? And so the idea for these non-ag co-ops is that they were going to come out of, as I mentioned, conversion of state enterprise units, gastronomy, food, restaurants, cafeteria, some light industry. And this is important to understand that the places that they, like the state was leasing the buildings, selling some equipment, but the buildings were still kept by the state and leased in a very good prices for the co-op. And this is seen as positive for some people who study what happened with co-ops in other places. No, like they end up selling these assets, and so the workers end up losing their jobs. But with the most recent changes, with all this reordenamiento, which is a whole story, how it's like the monetary and wage reordering, I guess, or reorganization that happened January 2021, which is we can talk for many hours about, that created some incentives for the state business that lease the buildings to the co-ops to want to increase the price of their leases. So that has created a few issues, but luckily those can be addressed. So I'm just gonna put that out there. And then some of these co-ops, of course, were people who wanted to create co-ops out of their own initiative, and those have been in all kinds of activity, but really the activity that is overrepresented is construction. And I can tell you that from what I saw, although there has been like over criticism of these co-ops, it's true that at that time it was not possible to create private businesses. No, only self-employed were allowed. And so there were some co-ops, especially in construction, that were really fake co-ops. These were a group of people who came together and they were basically hiring, well, fake co-ops for Cuban standards, no? Because the friends were managing like equitably, etc., but they were hiring others. So in other countries, that's totally normal for a co-op to hire labor, no? But those of us who really think about worker co-ops as equitable and inclusive and all that, it's not how a co-op should behave, no? And then I have in light gray because the idea was that local governments were going to promote co-ops, but in practice, it happened very little. And I'm not sure if we can blame the local governments for lack of initiative. I think there are all kinds of factors that happen there. So this is more in detail about the activities that these non-co-ops have done. As you see, it's mostly food around gastronomy, like restaurants, etc. And these are the produce markets, which in my view was a mistake. So I'm just gonna put it out there because when we did a study, we saw that everyone was happy with the co-ops except for these co-ops, which were state markets. So like produce markets where people buy most of their food, and they were state, and so their prices were subsidized. And suddenly, as they became co-ops, of course, the co-ops could not subsidize the price, and so prices increased, and people were not happy with that, of course. And so also, I think in my view that it's not really, the worker co-op model was not the right model for this type of activity. You don't want to have workers as intermediaries, no? If what they do is buy from the producers, the ag co-ops mostly, and sell to the people. So the way of organization, I think, for that type of business should have been either consumer co-ops or the producers coming together in second tier co-ops, no, and selling to the people, or a mix. As you might know, in Latin America, there is a blend of producer and consumer all coming together. So I think putting those like produce market, worker co-ops, and the construction, which is the green. So as you see, it's like two of the biggest activities, no, or the biggest number of co-ops. There was a very good view of co-ops in, no, and I think it's not fair also to generalize. I think it was like, as I mentioned, we are very critical in Cuba, and so there might have been a few construction co-ops that were really fake co-ops, but there were also many good construction co-ops that were people that were managed as worker co-ops. And so these non-ag co-ops, as I mentioned, they are mostly worker, but they could also be producers, in the sense that they have to contribute, members have to contribute labor or the results of their labor. And there are limits to wage work, no? It can only be hired temporarily and not more than 10% of the membership. Profits, or I should say surplus, should be distributed according to work, no? And there was only one reserve that was mandatory, is for like emergency, I think it's called like contingency. They were free to set their prices, as I said, which is a bit different from the ag co-ops because of what I explained. And so this, when this experiment was happening, they were going to be, and they still have preferential treatment. I'll show that later, but also they could buy from state enterprises, and that's something that now has been open to the private sector, but before only the co-ops could do. So what is the preferential treatment that co-ops get? Priority in leasing of state property. They can, at that time, they can carry out more economic activities. Right now, it's pretty much the same. Tax breaks, it's estimated that like half, like co-ops tax burden is like half of the similar private business. Although with all this reordenamiento, which many of us think is more than a reordenamiento, es un reguero. It's like it hasn't, it has been, it's a huge problem now, and you will see the there are in fact like co-ops are at a disadvantage in terms of taxation, and I'll explain that later. And so they could, I'm not sure if this is still happening, so that's why I had in question marks, but the co-ops could buy inputs at a wholesale prices with a 20% discount when the private sector could not. And they could also have more access to credit. But yeah. So this is a diagnostic within, like that's not the best translation, but the one I mentioned early on, like when these co-ops were like a year old or so, and it wasn't a representative sample, but it was significant sample. And yeah, I just want to share, and soon after this, with what we found. We found these non-ag co-ops, as I mentioned, were like, initially there was some hesitation, and especially older workers, as I explained, but soon after they saw what it meant to be an owner and all the advantages they had, people overall were happy. And so this is what people focus on, but if you like the increase in income and working conditions, but if you started asking deeper questions, you realize that what made them happiest was the ability, as I mentioned, to actually have power over the most important decisions in their workplace, no? And so in these co-ops, what we saw, it was management where resources were managed more efficiently. The work environment had improved, you know, how people related to each other. Although in Cuba, in state business is very horizontal, but still people, you know, like people felt they were sharing something more together. And except for the, as I mentioned, for the like the produce markets, most, like if you talk to people, they thought that co-ops were providing better quality without significant increase in prices. Oops. And then, yeah, I'm gonna stop here, but it's pretty much like what I have mentioned in the creation: lack of training and education, all the like access to inputs, as I mentioned, and then lack of access to some services, and that would that increase their cost. So just to end here before time for questions, I think, and I took a look at this, and I think it's still valid. No, it's like the situation has been evolving for the last couple of months. But I think it's still fair to say that there hasn't been really a state policy to promote co-ops, despite the fact that we have all these co-ops, and you could say, yeah, there is a policy supposedly, but we never saw it. There has been mention of a policy around 2012 before the legislation for the experiment on non-ag co-ops started, but we have never seen that policy. And that, I think, if we would see that policy, would see there are some holes in it, no, some things that haven't been done that are very important. And one part of that is that we haven't established the specialized institutions for promotion and supervision of co-ops. And here in the US, you might feel like we don't, like, to promote co-ops, you don't need much, because the US is actually, with Cuba and Haiti, the only country in the Americas that doesn't have a general co-op laws, I know in some states now they are, and they are also like many states that are passing worker co-op legislation. I know there are some issues with some legislation, but if you look at the experience in countries in Latin America where the state has actually decided to promote co-ops, and also in countries like Italy, France, it's very important to establish institutions also for representation, like the federation and other organizations that represent the interests of the co-ops, but also from the state perspective, institutions that really promote, like specialized promotion. The way it has been handled in Cuba is that each ministry, so the Ministry of Agriculture has the Department for Ags. The ministry for each ministry has supposedly someone who works with co-ops, but of course co-ops is way down in their priorities, and also they are in charge with promoting and supervising, and they don't know how to do neither, no. And so I think I also want to highlight that there was a misunderstanding of what the importance of co-op education, and so only in the latest legislation they finally mentioned co-op education as a principle, because I think people who were drafting this legislation before said, in Cuba we have enough education. What are you talking about cooperative education? We have free education all the way to graduate level. So hopefully now is understood that co-op education is to educate people to manage their business differently, and so finally we have that. But there are not many organizations that know how to do this. I actually work at, as I mentioned, the University of Havana, and we have a master's on cooperative management and development, but it only is able to get to around 100 or so people per program, per cycle. There are some other institutions. The Ministry of Agriculture has a school for training, but it's not just for co-ops. So there are some programs, but there is, for the number of co-ops, there is much more need, no? Also, local governments haven't really engaged co-ops. In rural areas, yes, but in urban areas, and not that much. And I should have taken out the streamlined approval process. Now it's very, it's for the new co-ops. The non-agriculture is very streamlined. So now with the new law, supposedly in like 1 month, by the time you submit your proposal and you're approved, it's like around 1 month, 1.5 months, compared to other countries, that's very fast. The problem is with the ag co-ops, that it's still very hard to create an ag co-op. And the ability to create second tier, as I mentioned, consumer and multi-stakeholder cooperative, we're still waiting for that. And of course, better access to goods and services, which could be addressed by the second tier co-ops, in my view. So I think I'm gonna stop. Yeah, and I had that last point, which I want to make sure you know, if you don't know already, that the US policy of basically at the end they talk about democracy and human rights, but it's just excuses for punishing the Cuban people for choosing their own way of government and their own way of organizing our society. I know that not many people, and now in these very hard times, many people are critical of the government, but I think when people think about like what are their alternatives, they know that the people who want to, how you say, bring down the current government are not representing the needs of the majority. So I think people, despite criticism of the current government, they don't want the government to be brought down, because it's only gonna increase the problems or create new problems. And people really value what the revolution has achieved, even if now with the current crisis, there are many problems in accessing like medicines, and the schools might not have everything that is needed. But I think maybe you know all this, but I just want to make the point that the U.S. policies really hurt the Cuban people, and as you know, they only cause people to lose hope in their ability to do living in Cuba. And so, instead of regime change, which is the goal of these policies, what they do is to migrate to the U.S., because also the U.S. has all these policies that encourage people to come to the U.S. to make the point that Cuba is a failed state also. And so, yeah, it has been very damaging. I can give you the numbers, like what he has meant like in the last year, but it's like beyond, like you cannot process all the damage in terms of numbers that it makes. And so I know I don't want to bring, I don't want for you to feel guilty, no, but I hope that when you go there and you see that we're in this hard situation, I just hope you were able to compare with how it was under Obama, where we still had pretty much the embargo, except for the ability for people to travel to Cuba. And we were not in the state sponsor of terrorism list. So we still had the embargo and the blockades, but we didn't have these 250 sanctions that Trump passed, plus the adding us to the state sponsors of terrorism list, which makes almost impossible any financial transaction to not even Cubans, but anyone in Cuba who wants to do any transactions. So yeah, if there is any way you can contribute to making the Biden administration know that you disagree with that, we would really appreciate it, because it's really, it needs to end. It's causing a lot of pain right now. And I'm sure you're gonna hear this when you go there, but in the middle of the pandemic, in the middle when, like, as the UN, I don't know, the chair of the UN, Guterres, was calling for the sanctions to be lifted, you need countries to help each other. The US government decided this was the time they wanted to bring the Cuban Revolution down. So it's very, very sad. Yeah, and it's a hard time in Cuba because of the pandemic, because of this. You can see, like, after the Trump started like passing all those sanctions, diminishing travel and all that, cutting the visas and all that, you could see how it impacted everyone. And then the pandemic came, and yeah, the reordenamiento. I'm critical of also, like, the management of the economy, but I think that it can be done differently. But I think it's not fair to blame mismanagement of the government, because you could see, like, even any other country who had to endure all these sanctions, I'm not sure they would be doing better than we are. So yeah, I'll end there.